When they refused to obey him, he sent an army against them and compelled them to give hostages, and to promise to do his bidding. He afterwards entered Italy in person with his army (787), and passed through Rome to Capua, a city in Campania, where he pitched his camp and threatened the Beneventans with hostilities, unless they should submit themselves to him. Their duke, Aragus, escaped the danger by sending his two sons, Rumold and Grimold, with a great sum of money to meet the king, begging him to accept them as hostages, and promising for himself and his people compliance with all the king's commands, on the single condition that his personal attendance should not be required. The king took the welfare of the people into account rather than the stubborn disposition of the duke, accepted the proffered hostages, and released him from the obligation to appear before him in consideration of his handsome gift. He retained the younger son only as hostage, and sent the elder back to his father, and returned to Rome, leaving commissioners with Aragus to extract the oath of allegiance, and administer it to the Beneventans. He stayed in Rome several days, in order to pay his devotions at the holy places, and then came back to Gaul. 787. Chapter 11. Tassilo and the Bavarian Campaign. At this time, on a sudden, the Bavarian War broke out, but came to a speedy end. It was due to the arrogance and folly of Duke Tassilo. His wife, Luitberga, a daughter of King Desiderius, was desirous of avenging her father's banishment through the agency of her husband, and accordingly induced him to make a treaty with the Huns, the neighbours of the Bavarians on the east, and not only to leave the king's commands unfulfilled, but to challenge him to war. Charles's high spirit could not brook Tassilo's insubordination, for it seemed to him to pass all bounds. Accordingly he straightway summoned his troops from all sides for a campaign against Bavaria, and appeared in person with a great army on the river Lech, which forms the boundary between the Bavarians and the Alemanni. After pitching his camp upon its banks, he determined to put the Duke's disposition to the test by an embassy before entering the province. Tassilo did not think that it was for his own or his people's good to persist, so he surrendered himself to the king, gave the hostages demanded, among them his own son Theodo, and promised by oath not to give ear to anyone who should attempt to turn him from his allegiance. So this war, which bade fair to be very grievous, came very quickly to an end. Tassilo, however, was afterward summoned to the king's presence (788), and not suffered to depart, and the government of the province that he had had in charge was no longer entrusted to a duke, but to counts. Chapter 12. Slavic War. After these uprisings had been thus quelled, war was declared against the Slavs, who are commonly known among us as Wiltzi, but properly, that is to say in their own tongue, are called Welatabians. The Saxons served in this campaign as auxiliaries among the tribes that followed the king's standard at his summons, but their obedience lacked sincerity and devotion. War was declared because the Slavs kept harassing the Abodriti, old allies of the Franks, by continual raids, in spite of all commands to the contrary. A gulf, i.e. the Baltic Sea, of unknown length, was nowhere more than 100 miles wide, and in many parts narrower, stretches off towards the east from the Western Ocean. Many tribes have settlements on its shores, the Danes and Swedes, whom we call Northmen, on the northern shore and all the adjacent islands, but the southern shore is inhabited by the Slava and the Aisti, from whom derive the modern name of Estonia, and various other tribes. The Welatabians, against whom the king now made war, were the chief of these, but in a single campaign (789), which he conducted in person, he so crushed and subdued them that they did not think it advisable thereafter to refuse obedience to his commands. Chapter 13. War with the Huns. The war against the Avars or Huns followed (791), and except the Saxon war was the greatest that he waged. He took it up with more spirit than any of his other wars, and made far greater preparations for it. He conducted one campaign in person in Pannonia, of which the Huns then had possession. He entrusted all subsequent operations to his son, Pepin, and the governors of the provinces, to counts even and lieutenants. Although they most vigorously prosecuted the war, it only came to a conclusion after 7 years' struggle. The utter depopulation of Pannonia, and the site of the Khan's palace, now a desert, where not a trace of human habitation is visible, bear witness how many battles were fought in those years, and how much blood was shed. The entire body of the Hun nobility perished in this contest, and all its glory with it. All the money and treasure that had been years amassing was seized, and no war in which the Franks have ever engaged within the memory of man brought them such riches and such booty. Up to that time the Huns had passed for a poor people, but so much gold and silver was found in the Khan's palace, and so much valuable spoil taken in battle, that one may well think that the Franks took justly from the Huns what the Huns had formerly taken unjustly from other nations. Only 2 of the chief men of the Franks fell in this war: Eric, Duke of Friuli, who was killed in Tarsach (799), a town on the coast of Liburnia, by the treachery of the inhabitants, and Gerald, governor of Bavaria, who met his death in Pannonia, slain (799) with 2 men that were accompanying him, by an unknown hand while he was marshalling his forces for battle against the Huns, and riding up and down the line encouraging his men. This war was otherwise almost a bloodless one so far as the Franks were concerned, and ended most satisfactorily, although by reason of its magnitude it was long protracted. End of section 2. Read by Kara Schallenberg on October 16th, 2007, in Oceanside, California.